The statistics show us that women vote more than men, but we're clearly nowhere near parity when it comes to women in elected office. So is the solution just to get more women to run for public office?
Well, that might be part of the solution, but that will only be a satisfying solution if it were the case that women did not face discrimination once they choose to run. So if we believe we're in a world where voters no longer care whether the candidate is a man or a woman, then yes, the solution is just to get more women to run. I think the question is whether we're in that world.
Okay, fair enough. You've also studied this phenomenon of what you call election aversion. What does that mean and how does it apply here?
Well, a lot of scholars are trying to reconcile two facts. One is the one that you mentioned, which is that women are underrepresented in office. But the second fact is that when women do run, they win about as often as men. In other words, if you choose to run as a woman, you're about as likely to win as your male counterparts. And so the puzzle is, how can we have so little representation of women when we know that if they run, they are just as likely to win as men? And so a lot of people have been focused on the question of why aren't more women running? And one of the answers has to do with a broad category of ideas around election aversion, which is either that women don't like competition as much as men, whether running for office takes them away from their families, which they're less willing to do, those kind of explanations.
Okay, your take on this is that perhaps there's some of that, but there's also voter bias, that has not gone away. Explain what this voter bias looks like and whether there are other parallels to it.
Sure thing. And the reason I reached this conclusion is because the fact that women win as often as men when they do run doesn't mean there's no discrimination. I think a lot of people have been quick to conclude, oh, when women run, they win, there must not be discrimination. But in fact, it is entirely possible that there's lots of discrimination, and therefore only the most talented and well-qualified women run. Those women do win as often as men, but there's lots of women who are not running and who wouldn't win because of this discrimination. And so what voter discrimination could look like is only a small set of talented women who can overcome that discrimination run, and we still have underrepresentation overall. And what that looks like, or what we've argued in our work, is that it very much looks like the integration, for example, of Major League sports. And we call this the Jackie and Jill Robinson effect. And what you saw in the beginning of the integration of baseball or lots of other sports is that African-American players who were the first to integrate the sport had to be much better than the white players who they were competing with in order to overcome the bias on the part of owners and fans, for example. And so we're arguing there's something similar going on in politics. Women have to be better in order to overcome this bias. And so a lot of our work has been to document, that they are better in performing. And we've got a number of ways of looking at that. Mm-hmm. And what discrimination really looks like is there's a higher bar for women, fewer running, fewer are in office, but those that are in office are really good.
So does someone like Kamala Harris, a Jill Robinson figure who's better than a lot of the male candidates who could be running, does she inspire a generation of women to run for office? And how sustainable is that burst of interest or enthusiasm good for? Is it for 1 or 2 election cycles or something longer?
I think that's exactly the question. And one question is, does she inspire that next generation of women to run for office, which is the question you raised? But the other question is, does she inspire the voters themselves to become more open-minded about having women run for office? So I think, as I've said, it may not be enough that we get more women running for office unless we also get voters to be more receptive to that idea. And so I think the hope would be that somebody like Kamala Harris achieves both of those things, inspires growth, both groups of people, both of the candidates who would run and the voters who would vote for them, to become more receptive.
Got it. Very quickly here, is there a double standard here for women because they need to be as good as or better than men, whereas any unqualified man can run for office and they won't hold it against, voters won't hold it against the entire male gender?
That sure seems to be true. In fact, there's lots of evidence that men and women of equal qualifications, the women evaluate themselves as being less qualified. So if you look at people who on paper have the same background, same employment, same education, same experience, the woman would rate herself as less qualified than the man. And so I often tell to my female students or anyone really, if you're a woman and you're kind of on the margin of running and think maybe you're barely qualified, you should really probably run because there's probably some other man out there who's half as qualified as you and thinks he's twice as qualified.